I'm so excited and honored to introduce our Conversatorio on Roberto Lovato's memoir, Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas, published by Harper Collins in 2020. Roberto Lovato is an educator, a journalist, and a writer based at the Writer's Grotto in San Francisco, California. He's a co-founder of #Dignidad Literaria. While you may know Roberto Lovato as a journalist and author for many Central American scholars, organizers, and activists, Roberto's an organizer, a solidarity movement guru, and a general troublemaker in the service of the Salvadoran cause and Central Americans generally. Many of us met Roberto in organizing settings, in protest, or in secret meetings to strategize about solidarity movements in El Salvador and Central America, immigrant rights struggles, protesting police and INS, or ICE. If you were an organizer in the know, you knew Roberto Lovato, who served as a former director of the Central American Resource Center in Los Angeles and was one of the founders of the first Central American Studies program at California State University, Northridge. Salvadorans in California were central in the story we now know about El Salvador and about Salvadoran immigrants who arrived in the shadows of Reagan's empire and legacy of war, torture, and destruction. Over 70,000 murders and nearly half of the population displaced and forced to flee. California has also been a critical site of Salvadoran and Central American resistance, where anti-imperialist organizing flourished on the ground in labor and community organizations and for mutual aid, the solidarity movement you may not have known about, the South-to-South mutual aid, solidarity organizing that happened in the shadows of US empire and led by undocumented immigrants. Central American parents, many of them those immigrants, not only sustained themselves and their families, fought for immigrant rights and labor rights, the right to city and political space in California and other parts of the US, they also sustained the movements in El Salvador. The fight for justice and the fight to reveal the murders and carnage in the wars of the 1980s, as well as service witnesses and resistance to a century of invasion, war, and torture at the hands of US empire. Yet younger generations of Salvadorans and Central Americans, including many of us on this panel, did not have access to our histories in schools in the US, from elementary school to college, even in graduate schools. It seemed that we were meant to forget and our histories to be forgotten. There were silences and omissions, silences imposed by a killer state, and silences which were self-imposed for protection and self-preservation during CIA covert wars and to avoid persecution by death squads, which reached the soil of Los Angeles on various occasions. Silences also protected those left behind. On her award-winning essay on silences, Salvadoran refugees then and now, Dr. Lacey Abrego reflects on how silences have led to tragic outcomes in our society. And I quote, "Without complex or balanced representations of Salvadorans or Central Americans in any mainstream media or social institution, whether in English or in Spanish language, even well-meaning, well-educated observers do not have the proper framework through which to understand what is happening. Without the language to recognize the vast ways the US is implicated in people's forced migration, or without the words to understand the forced nature of their displacement, even sympathetic members of the public want to quote unquote integrate these newcomers and envelop them in messages of quote unquote si se puede that are too simplistic and even problematic for the current circumstances." End quote. Many who migrated during one of the worst times in Salvadoran history, at the height of the war and US invasion, which tore the country apart and destroyed life as they knew it, could not even talk about it. They were lumped into a Latino world that would not even fathom what they lived, could not even fathom what they lived and how they survived. Solidarity movements that emerged in the US were important and critical to the war at home, but also single-handedly made victims of immigrants, narratives which continue even today on analyses of caravans and unaccompanied minors, charity at the US-Mexico border. One-dimensional narratives that flatten and obfuscate Salvadoran and Central American agency, resistance, and radical organizing that has taken place for over 30 years in the United States and for over a century in the region of Central America. Dr. Ana Patricia Rodriguez, in her book, Dividing the Isthmus, Central American Transnational Histories, Literatures, and Cultures, published by the University of Texas Press, writes, and I quote, "Attempts to build affinities, alliances, and quote unquote common ground across the border must also recognize that solidarity is problematic and not transparent, and that it is critically shaped by borders, different and unequal hierarchical relationships, even with Latina and Latino communities. Moreover, the subject that extends solidarity to another also takes agency away from that other who is subjected to acts of solidarity, end quote. Rodriguez has called these narratives solidarity fictions in which Central American histories and struggles form the backstage of someone else's romantic story of revolution, war, and rescue. Of course, there are examples of anti-imperialist and feminist solidarity, but those narratives rarely take the main stage, such as the South-to-South anti-imperialist organizing of immigrants I mentioned earlier. Lovato's Unforgetting is voice, agency, a parteaguas in the historical memory of an unfinished project for Salvadorans and Central Americans in the US, a story told by a Salvadoran about home, both the mission in San Francisco and Ahuachapan in El Salvador. It reclaims dignity for the Salvadoran people of this time, not as victims, but as resistors and radical organizers. The ones we all knew growing up in Los Angeles or San Francisco, leading efforts from fighting for temporary protected status, immigration reform, to efforts to stop and revert the coup in Honduras in 2009, to the ones fighting for the release of incarcerated Central American mothers at Carnes detention facility in Texas and unaccompanied children in inhumane private blackout prisons. It is true that Salvadorans and Central Americans in the US, if it's true that Salvadorans and Central Americans in the US are made of secrets, Lovato's Unforgetting is telling all the secrets as a first step to heal centuries of violence and senseless bloodshed by US State Department and US corporations. He's setting the record straight, but also lovingly remembering, bearing witness to our elders, marking the mass graves, and wielding the machete of memories, obstinate to exist, but also is speaking from a Salvadoran and from a Central American perspective, from within and not as an outsider looking in or as a subject. Unforgetting makes an undeniable contribution to the emerging field of Central American studies in the US and in Central America and Latin America by capturing a time and space during Roberto's life that has been a mirror for some and an important historical document for younger generations. Unforgetting seeks to unearth truths about the past for the present and for future generations, so that justice will not elude them as it has thus far. It is the seed that will sow justice in the future. And that is how you nail a dictator and US empire. After a brief reading by Roberto Lovato, two scholars will engage in what I promise will be a deep and radical dive into the text, Salvadoran memories and history of the Isthmus and here in the United States. One of our speakers after his reading will be Dr. Ana Patricia Rodriguez, who is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and US Latino Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Rodriguez is the author of Dividing the Isthmus, Central American Transnational Histories, Literatures, and Cultures, published by the University of Texas Press in 2009, and co-editor with Linda J. Kraft and Asvaldur Asvaldsson of De la Hamaca al Trono y al Más Allá, Lecturas Críticas de la Obra de Manlio Argueta, first published at the Universidad Tecnológica in 2013, and then later in 2016 at the Universidad Don Bosco. She's completing a book manuscript on post-memory in the Central American diasporas. Our other panelist is Dr. Stephen Osuna, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at California State University, Long Beach. His scholarship appears in various journals, including Ethnicities, Race and Class, the Journal for World Systems Research, Chiricu Journal, Latino, Latina Literatures, Arts and Culture, and the edited volumes such as The Futures of Black Radicalism and US Central Americans, Reconstructing Memory, Struggles, and Community of Resistance. Without further ado, I turn it over to Roberto Lovato for a reading of Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas.
Wow, what a beautiful introduction. Thank you, Suyapa. Ante todo, agradecerle a Yaconda Herrera, la presidenta de LASA, Ula Berg, la presidenta de programación, todo el equipo de LASA en hacer posible este panel, que para nosotros los centroamericanos es histórico. Los centroamericanos en Estados Unidos ya que somos varios millones y somos como el frente sur del continente insurgente de América. Y ¿cómo se llama? Les doy la bienvenida. Thank you. Before anything, I also want to say, if you want a free ebook of my book, it's available you can go on the Facebook site, and my publisher, Harper will make available a free ebook to the scholars that go in and request one. I don't know what, Homeland Security, whatever they're asking for, but they'll give you a free copy of the book, and it's in the Facebook site. I also want to thank Suyapa for bringing us all together. Suyapa's, been despite her youth, a long time organizer, scholar, which is a part of our tradition as Centroamericanos, right? That, we've always been uniting the word and the deed. And Suyapa and Ana and Stephen are all within the continuum of what I call the warrior scholar tradition of the Americas. So in that spirit, I want to share the epilogue of my book, which is about, in many ways, it's about my search to understand what makes El Salvador and my own part of El Salvador so violent, and more importantly, what helps us to overcome that. And so at the end of the book, I'm kind of reflecting on my journey across 2,500 miles and 30 years in my case, and then 90 if you include my father's story, of a landscape pocked with genocide, war, gang violence, narco violence, state violence. And I tell it from a very personal and intimate perspective. And as I say in the book, I try to show the way that the epic, what we have been calling the epic, is always made up of kind of like chips of the intimate. And so I'm reflecting on this, and I'm thinking about, I'm a student of theology, a former student of theology, and so I make a reference to a study, and I'll begin there. In 2011, I read a book by theologian Anatea Poitier-Young called Apocalypse Against Empire. The book posited that one purpose of early Jewish apocalyptic literature, such as the Book of Daniel, the Apocalypse of Weeks, and the Book of Dreams, was to counteract the effects of the state terror of the Seleucid Empire, which murdered tens of thousands of Jews in a very short period. In Poitier-Young's words, those of early apocalyptic literature, I saw reflected the fragments of Salvadoran lives scattered across time and space that I was trying to map. In the book, Poitier-Young brilliantly intertwines modern trauma research with the cultural implications of mass violence enacted on entire populations of people. She writes, psychiatrist and trauma researcher Judith Herman has argued that the trauma has the effect of stopping time, trapping its victims in a scene of terror that intrudes again and again into the present. Past and future recede, such that victims of trauma may become disconnected from their history and unable to formulate hope. For psychiatrist Marty Horowitz, because such trauma can challenge one's sense of identity and order in the world, the fragmented iconic memory repeats and continues to traumatize until it is placed within a new ordering schema that allows the survivor to, quote, understand. The historical apocalypse study in this volume intervene into this traumatic rupture in time, reconnecting past, present, and future so that their audiences can reclaim their history and self and move forward again in hope. Days after reading Poitier-Young's powerful take on the apocalyptic trauma, her words were still resonating so profoundly that I felt driven to reach out to her. She was kind enough to speak with me, but when I called her, she wondered why I, a journalist, was interested in her theological work. I'm not entirely sure, I said, but it has something to do with being Salvadoran. Well, you might be interested to know that in trying to understand trauma and other effects of state terror, as well as the spirit of resistance to that terror, I studied the experiences of state terror in two countries, Argentina during the Dirty War and wartime El Salvador. I thanked her and hung up before starting to cry because of the fact I would never forget. that as Salvadorans, we know as much about apocalypse as anyone. I'm sitting at my favorite table at Cafe La Boheme on 24th near Mission with my laptop in front of me, attempting to stitch together the disparate pieces of my origins as I write this book. The varnished oak tabletop sits on the base of an antique sewing machine. Its 12 by 10 iron treadle and the iron gears it powers still in place. Even though there's no longer a sewing machine above, the pedal moves the metal beast lying below most customers' awareness. In its black latticed elegance and noisy rotations, remind me of bouncing on the lap of Mamate, the Salvadoran seamstress whose máquina de coser fueled her family's 3,000-mile journey to San Francisco. Pushing the pedal slowly, I start typing. The pin attached to the pedal of the sewing machinery below pushes and pulls the treadle wheel. To the annoyance of the techie sitting next to me, it squeaks every few revolutions. But still, the wheel turns up and down, up and down, up and down. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 motion of my foot working the treadle hypnotizes me. Next to the wheel, in the center of the space below the table, sits the machine's wrought iron logo, slightly rusty silver and faded black laurels garnishing the Art Deco letters spelling the Singer Manufacturing Company. Coming here is a ritual of mine, something about coming to the neighborhood of my birth to write atop an old Singer sewing machine in a cafe named for the romantic opera La Boheme makes it easier to do the personal forensic work of recovering the fragments of my childhood and adolescent memories, especially the ones that are often more painful to conjure. I look out the window up the street toward Horse Man, my old junior high school, and I remember the shame, confusion, and molten anger I felt as a kid. I always had a sense that somewhere deep within me that Pop's secrets, his family history and upbringing, had something to do with his emotional absence and his violent temperament, even as it inspired his magic and charisma. Yet I lacked the history and therefore the context to understand him. Like many Salvadoreño skeletons lying scattered and unstoried all over the southwestern part of the North American continent, Pop's memories, which might have assuaged my own nihilistic rage by helping me understand and address its source, were lost for decades. Today, the plight of many of the kids I've met, Mara kids I've met, fits the shit travels downward theory of violence that I developed when I started going to Berkeley, a theory I came up with thanks in no small part to Pop. This downward momentum is created by the silence of both victims and perpetrators of violence, keeping us stuck in those moments, enabling the same cycles to play out time and time again. My search for my own unknown past is one reason I was so enthralled by the Instituto de Medicina Legal, the forensic lab in El Salvador, of so many untold stories. Watching their rituals of forensic recovery led me to believe that Unforgetting is a critical way to start the process of individual, family, and national healing. The power to reconstruct the bones of a person and return them to the family haunted by the disappearance of their loved one enables a critical step towards healing. It's the knowing that their loved one is dead and how he or she died that allows these families to conduct burial rites and mourn. Without Unforgetting, they can have no closure and are held in a terrible limbo. The same applies to reconstructing the bones of our personal and national memories, including the memory of what it is to be American, the identity that has caused so much devastation to those of us who identify as Salvadoran. Being American has taught me that the difficult future before us demands that we set aside the myths and infantile stories we tell ourselves in this country. Being Salvadoreño has taught me about the still urgent need to create the epic revolutionary sensibility we will need to survive the epic history that awaits us in the best of circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. And now I want to turn the mic over to Dr. Ana Patricia Rodriguez.
Okay. Buenas tardes. Es un gusto estar aquí con Roberto Lovato, con Steven Osuna y también con Suyapa. Y quiero agradecer a Ula Berg por organizar este conversatorio So it's a pleasure to be here with Roberto Lovato, Steve Osuna, and Suyapa Portillo, and I want to thank Ula Berg for organizing this plenary conversation revolving around Roberto Lovato's book, which I have had the pleasure of reading several times now, once before it was published. So I've seen its evolution, and it is a great privilege to be here and to be invited to comment on it, because I think also that it's a really important moment in US Central American literature, in Salvadoran literature in the United States. And I look at Roberto's book as one of these not only a transnational text, because it speaks to the experiences, historical experiences of diasporic communities that were forced to flee El Salvador during the Civil War, like other communities forced to flee other sites of war throughout the world. But also it's a text that I'm reading it as a spine where it stands up for itself, but also it connects to different organisms. So I'm, thinking of, our experiences as a body of experiences, tactile, emotional, etc. So I want to speak to his book as this really momentous moment in US Central American Transisthmian literature, as Suyapa referred to. So again, thank you for having me here. And I don't want to take up too much time, because we do want to converse around Unforgetting. But I wanted to talk about his book in the larger context of US Central American literature, US Central American transnational literature, specifically that literature produced here in the US. And also I wanted to talk about this text as a very important incursion into what I see as a literature, a US Central American literature that is popping up in different parts of the country. Of course, Los Angeles, Washington, DC, Houston, other places where we have other diasporic writers, writing from their different diasporic experiences. But I also wanted to speak to the experience of San Francisco, California, which, once you read the book, how central it is to not only the book Unforgetting, but also to the Central American diaspora in these communities of solidarity that Dr. Portillo mentioned earlier. So I want to reference, the important location of San Francisco as this site, this wellspring of organizing, of social movements, of solidarity movements, where Central American Salvadoreños were, the main actors as they were coming into the city in the 1980s, if not before. And I also wanted to talk about the process of unforgetting that organizes Roberto's book, especially in light that Central American history is premised on acts of willful, intentional, and forced forgetting through wars, massacres, disappearances, and forced forgetting through all these, acts of disappearances, and also living in the margins. But also I wanted to, recall that, forgetting also happens discursively through disciplines, through disciplining bodies, through disciplining particularly migrants. I wanted to invoke, the work of Michel Foucault, that, we become subjects through power and through violence. And so it's really important to recognize that the act of unforgetting also produces actors and agents of remembering and forgetting and unforgetting, which is what this book also allows the public to do, to unforget these acts that we have been forced to forget. And to name some of the examples, of course, one key moment in Salvadoran history is the 1932 massacre, where over 30,000 indigenous people were massacred by the government, the military dictatorship of El Dictador Maximiliano Martinez Hernandez. And also, as a consequence, the erasure of indigenous identities, and of course, Black identities, Black subjects in Centro America and El Salvador. So the discursive part, I'd like to, connect it to what Virginia Tilley comments in her book, Seeing Indian. The forgetting of indigenous presence in El Salvador was particularly violent, and it was particularly discursive, enacted through erasure, through census acts that just didn't even include the classifications. So there was no place where indigenous peoples could be recorded and documented, a willful act of discursive forgetting. And then, of course, the Civil War, where almost 80,000 people were killed, disappeared. And in a moment immediately after the war, we had programs of reconstruction and reconciliation and of peace that sought willfully to put the war behind, to start to reconstruct the country in terms of building neoliberal economies, which yet again attempted, or the effect of all that was to erase the history of the Civil War. And so, that happened immediately after the Civil War ended. And presently, I wanted to also remind us that we're in a moment of actful forgetting. If you have been following the legislative acts in El Salvador right now, where a great number of laws are being sent to archivo, to die in archives, laws such as la Ley General de Aguas, la Ley de Cambio Climático, la Ley de Prohibición de Plástico de un Solo Uso, la Ley de Defensa Social y Abandono de la Violencia, as well as laws that have to do with gender and gender violence. So la Ley de Identidad de Género para Personas Trans, y la ley para erradicar la muerte violenta de niñas y mujeres, and also la ley que despenaliza or would have despenalizar el aborto for las tres causas. Anyways, these are active acts and legal acts of disappearances and forgetting that are actively going on today. Why I mention this in relation to Roberto's book is that there is a pattern in, especially I think, Salvadoran history and Salvadoran society to willfully forget, including to forget the diaspora, the experiences of migration, the experiences of migrants who continually suffer, the violence of crossing multiple borders and being rejected and denied safe haven once they attempt to reach, for example, the United States. So there's also little documentation and willful forgetting of the experiences of migrants, whereas, they are valued in as much as their remittance sending power. Salvadorans, almost $5 billion being sent annually, right? So we're always in an act and in a process of forgetting in El Salvador and in Central America. If anything, for that reason alone, Roberto's book is extremely important in this moment in time, because it is part of that tradition of counter-remembering, of counter-unforgetting that courageous writers in Central America have been enacting throughout history. I only have to name some of the authors of the war period, like Manlio Argueta, Roque Dalton, in the United States, Roberto Lovato, Martibón Galindo, also from San Francisco, and many others that I can't name, but who engage in this literature of unforgetting, that use their voice to carve out spaces so that we don't lose the memory of these experiences of violence in Central America. Also, I want to encourage us to also use Roberto's book as a pedagogical tool. I have already, actually assigned his book last semester and used it as a way of being able to touch all those different points in Salvadoran history that, we have forgotten. and that in the context of the diaspora, we need to, recall, and we need to make part of our living history in order for us not to repeat it. I know it's, that's a cliche, but I think that this book allows us to cover moments from settler colonialism, from the foundation of the nation. It's really telling in his book how he talks about San Francisco as this site of the coffee companies, right? Hills Brothers, Folgers Company, who were part of this early economic intervention in Central America with their extractivist economies, extracting natural resources, coffee, etc., right? Building an industry, multi-million, billion-dollar industry around, coffee, and leading to migrations of people, right? Because also with the economy, human labor was extracted that then resurfaces in places like San Francisco, and that laid the cornerstones, I think, as Roberto lays out in his book, of his own migration, my own migration of my family to San Francisco, all connected with, those earlier extractivist presences of the United States and Central America. So you can read all these different moments across the book and use the book as a pedagogical tool to talk about US imperialism, to talk about corporate extraction in Central America, to talk about of course, the migrations of people throughout, the 20th century, to talk about the Civil War, to talk about the post-war period and the violence, that is increasingly happening in Central America, connected to, the larger neoliberal and global forces, and to talk about finally, the migration that we're seeing today across the isthmus, and that is impacting a great part of our community. So having said that, I'm going to pass on the mic to Stephen, who will fill in with more history, I think. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Buenas tardes. Thank you for inviting me to this important panel. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my comrade Mary and Adine, who are currently watching my son for me to be here for today. So thank you all for supporting in the reproductive labor of my child. Roberto Lovato's Unforgetting is an urgent reminder to sit with the beauty and messiness in our lives, our traumas, and the historical moments that shape our present and possibly our futures. This memoir is an invitation, or more like a demand, to remember the past and present violence of settler colonialism, anti-communism, and U.S. imperialist interventions in El Salvador. More importantly for me, Lovato's memoir serves as a tool for the growing field of Central American studies to analyze 1, the role of the organic intellectual in our political praxis, 2, the capitalist state and its ideological and repressive apparatuses, and 3, the importance of an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist position when studying El Salvador, Central America, and the experience of Central Americans in the U.S. The latter is crucial for a Central American studies that has truly a preferential option for the poor and oppressed, rather than the conceit of multicultural inclusion into the neoliberal university. Unforgetting is a memoir, but it should be also read as a methods of work in agitating, organizing, and mobilizing our communities to not just understand our conditions, but to change them through revolution. In the prison notebooks, communist intellectual Antonio Gramsci argues, quote, "The starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory," unquote. In this memoir, Lovato, as a scholar, journalist, activist, and organizer, takes us through his own journey of remembering the infinite traces of his life as a child of Salvadoran migrants in the Mission District of San Francisco. By navigating through histories, borders, silences, and half-truths, Lovato excavates his family's past, his participation in the Salvadoran revolutionary struggle, and the gangs as a cause of every problem thesis in El Salvador. While mainstream media, liberal academics, law enforcement, and U.S. presidents point towards gangs such as MS-13 as the culprit of Central America's social problems, Lovato disrupts this claim. Quote, my story is apocalyptic in the original sense of the term in Greek, apocalypto, to uncover, lay open what has been veiled or covered up, unquote. Like a finely made braid, Lovato interlaces his family's history with the history of El Salvador. Through the Matanza of 1932, the migrations of Salvadorans to Mexico and the U.S., the revolutionary struggles of the 80s, the criminalization of youth, and the caging of Salvadoran refugees during the Obama and Trump administration, Lovato and his family are always present. Rather than bystanders, Lovato shows how he, his grandmother, his father, his mother, his aunts and cousins were all active agents in the making of El Salvador and the Mission District of San Francisco. Through Memoria Histórica, Lovato shares his journey of uncovering his father's intimate connections to the 1932 massacre of over 30,000 indigenous peoples, peasants, and communists. The moment his father shares his testimony is one of the most powerful images in the memoir. Quote, at the moment, my 80-year-old father became the 9-year-old boy who'd witnessed one of the worst massacres in the history of the Americas, unquote. Through the use of the quote-unquote machete of memory that cuts and slices through his family history and Salvadoran reality, Lovato models an organic intellectual in the Gramscian sense. According to Gramsci, organic intellectuals can emerge from the subaltern classes, working classes that is, to provide ideological, cultural, intellectual, and political consciousness and leadership to their class, their allies, and other subordinate groups. Organic intellectuals are not in a separate compartment from the masses, but rather immersed in their daily struggles, dialectically teaching and learning from them. In Gramsci's words, quote, the intellectual's error is consist in believing that it is possible to know without understanding, and especially without feeling and passion. That the intellectual can be an intellectual if they're distinct and detached from the people, without feeling the elemental passion for the people, understanding them and thus explaining and justifying them in a particular historical situation, connecting them dialectically to the laws of history, to a superior conception of the world, unquote. Like Gramsci's organic intellectual, Lovato's memoir, like his journalism and political organizing, is linked to the everyday struggle of the working class Salvadorans and other oppressed peoples. Lovato describes how his political consciousness and development emerged from the Salvadoran reality in El Salvador and the U.S. Like him, many of us Central Americans and other Latinxes have entered the U.S. Academy as first-generation university students from working class backgrounds and from migrant, refugee, and barrio families. These material conditions shape our relationship to knowledge production. However, academia and the university construct neoliberal subjects whose academic entrepreneurialism, careerism, accolades, and university prestige produce class seductions. There have been many anti-colonial Marxist thinkers like Walter Rodney and Amilcar Cabral who argued for those who entered the middle strata of society to struggle against their class aspirations, to commit suicide as a class. For Central American studies scholars who emerge from the conditions facing Central Americans in the U.S. and the Isthmus, this is paramount. Our political praxis as academic intellectuals must be grounded with our communities and the many contradictions that exist within them. I believe Lovato and his memoir is one model in this undertaking, an intervention in the battleground of ideas. Although not explicitly stated in his memoir, Lovato illustrates the methods of working through an analysis of the capitalist state, its repressive and ideological apparatuses, and their use by elites to defend capital and imperialism. Lovato's analysis of the violence shaping the everyday lives of Salvadorans in his memoir moves us away from studying violence as a tangle of pathologies or a culture of poverty, and instead excavate its historical material conditions. Instead of reifying gang violence in El Salvador, Lovato urges us to think deeply and to try to understand what turns kids into violent and even murderous gang members, while also upholding spaces for the child victims of this violence, what he calls a, quote, double helix of death that condemns many in El Salvador. In many scenes of the memoir, Lovato forces us to reckon with the whirlwind of emotions that does not explain away the violence, but rather helps us understand it. Through his own investigation, Lovato argues the violence we often hear about through the corporate media is, quote, no small part an expression of forgotten American violence. He reminds us that the most destructive agents in El Salvador are not the youth gangs, but the gangs in suits who are, quote, protected by even more violent gangs in military uniforms. Lovato gives us a timeline of capitalist state violence as a response to people's organizing and surviving under capitalism. He mentions the Matanza as a response to peasants and indigenous people organizing against U.S. corporations, against the planter class, against corporations like Hills Brothers Coffee. He talks about the Sumpu River massacre, the El Mozote massacre, also as a response to the revolutionary uprising of the people. The recent pre-trial hearings of El Mozote massacre highlighted for us what many already knew. In the U.S., Lovato also shows us and describes the use of police repression to manage and control surplus populations in Los Angeles and their caging through migrant detention centers in Texas. Criminalization is one of the oldest tools of capital to control and manage the working class. In Unforgetting, we see the ideological condition of criminalization and its effects through corporate media like Univision, police cooperation between the Los Angeles Police Department, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the Salvadoran National Police, and visits from Rudy Giuliani as a paid consultant to the National Association of Private Enterprise in El Salvador. As Lovato notes, the gang as a cause of every problem thesis is an hegemonic interpretation of the violence in El Salvador that masks rather than reveals the right violence of the capitalist state. If you follow Lovato's journalism covering state violence in El Salvador, the right-wing movement in Venezuela, the drug war in Mexico, and U.S. imperialism in general, you know he does not shy away from showing us his rage. Rage is my vocation, he says. By way of Cuban musician Silvio Rodriguez's lyrics in Días en Flores, we learn the origins of Lovato's rage and how it shifted from his family, El Salvador, and himself to U.S. imperialism. He provides a revolutionary analysis from his experience involved in revolutionary struggle. This necessity for a revolutionary analysis that Lovato offers emerges from maintaining an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist position when discussing the realities of Central America and its diaspora in the U.S. In discussing the geopolitics of the 2009 coup d'etat in Honduras, Lenca land defender and organizer Berta Cáceres, for example, notes, "It is very important that social movements and progressive governments understand that Honduras is not an isolated cause, but is part of a bigger project of domination for the entire hemisphere. Imperialism will continue with its project of destabilization, coup d'etats, and it's not an exception. It's part of a counteroffensive of world power." For Central American studies and scholars in the U.S., it is paramount that we have this analysis of an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist perspective. Cáceres' call to social movements and progressive governments is instructive for us, especially at a moment when we're trying to understand the root causes of poverty, exploitation, oppression, and what has become a popular critique of corruption and narco-gobiernos. For Cáceres, an anti-imperialist analysis must inform popular and political education and organizing and struggling against the dismantling of capitalism, colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. In this tradition of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist thought, Lovato unforgets his revolutionary perspective to offer his readers an alternative history, an indictment of imperialism, global capitalism, and U.S. foreign policy in El Salvador. He does this accompanied by his family, his community, and his people. To conclude, Central American studies scholar Esther E. Hernandez argues, quote, "The process of transmitting cultural memory brings to light the history of the diaspora. Through her use of the concept, quote, working memory, Hernandez shows us U.S.-based Central Americans use film, murals, and performances to revisit complex and contradictory narratives of war, migration, and resistance. Adding to this working memory and history of the Salvadoran diaspora, Lovato's Unforgetting contributes to U.S.-based Central American cultural production, activism, organizing, and the growing field of Central American studies. It is part and parcel of a growing tradition of U.S.-based Central Americans writing their own radical histories of U.S. imperialism and global capitalism. Unforgetting offers methods of work in understanding contemporary Central America. As we continue to hear, see, and organize against the exploitation, caging, raiding, and deporting of our people in the U.S. and the neo-fascism emerging in Central America, let us remember Lovato's call to action. We must never forget the root causes of the trauma, forced displacement, and exploitation and criminalization. We must never forget the dignity and revolutionary aspirations of our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and Dr. Stephen Osuna and Dr. Ana Patricia for your analysis. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a conversation and kind of have a back and forth with the author. If any of you want to ask a question now, feel free. I can throw out the first question I'm dying to ask. So Roberto, how do you see the role of young Central Americans in the U.S. now? Both of these authors have clearly positioned your text in Central American studies in the U.S., right? How do you see the role of young Central Americans in the current situation that we're facing?
Well, I mean, young is relative, right? I look at Stephen, I see young, I see all of you as young.
Thanks.
So all of you. But Yeah, and thank you for those interventions. They were, very thoughtful as I expected. And the one thing I didn't like is that you all don't, y'all just frame me as fucking leftist again when I'm trying to be an author now. And, but I'll forgive you for that. No, but seriously speaking, the role of young Central Americans, I see, let's look at the country that we're in right now, right? I mentioned, I see young Central Americans and some of us among the older generations, as I said, as kind of the northern front of the insurgent continent of the Americas. And I want us to unforget that part. There's something I call the continental unconscious that kind of connects peoples across the Americas, whether it's through Abiyala, the Bolivarian imaginary, and other kind of ways of seeing ourselves connected to the continent. We represent a unique threat, all of us, to this nation state idea of the United States. I think that's why we're being erased from the national narrative of the United States. And so I think within that context, young Central Americans and others of us have a high calling to show what it is to face. Stephen mentioned it, I mentioned it in my interview, apocalyptic levels of violence. I got that not from my own thing, I got it from scholars at Oxford who study world violence, and they position El Salvador as one of the most violent, consistently violent countries on earth. So as a peoples that have overcome and even at moments defeated in battle and in our own hearts, in our bodies, the workings of U.S. empire, we have something to say and do here in this country that's in dangerous decline. As you can see here in San Jose this weekend, where some white dude got a semi-automatic weapon and shot up a bunch of non-white people and a couple of white people. I don't want to ascribe racial motives, but it was one of the almost 70% of the white men who are responsible for most of the mass killings in the United States. So we're seeing a Salvadoreñización, a Latino-Americanización of the United States in terms of the hollowing out of the welfare state, the division between rich and poor, and the heavy policing and the militarization of the police here in the United States. And I think we are young Central Americans I see you all there in the front lines in Black Lives Matter alongside the Black community and in solidarity with the anti-Asian coalition, that anti-Asian violence coalitions that are forming, and in our own defense and our own issues, like against death squads over there in Los Angeles, where Esteban and Suyapa are. So I see the young people continuing the tradition. I think, and I'll end with this, I think we have an important role, Ana and Suyapa and Esteban and others of us who are part of the discipline of Central American studies, to pass on the Jedi knowledge of that marvelous part of our experience in the revolutionary movements, in the revolutionary organizing and ways of thinking and doing. I don't know about being an organic intellectual, but I do think that I'm trying to bring whatever Jedi knowledge I had access to and share it and drop it as if we need to drop it and drop it now because we're facing this unprecedented moment.
Thank you. I think Dr. Stephen Osuna had a question.
Oh no, I was going to just comment on that question you asked. I think it's important to respond to that from my point of view too. And that's why in this my comments I mentioned the importance of his book, of Lovato's book, as far as Central American studies, right? And I mention it as a methods of work. And what I mean by that, again, right, the idea of what is the role of Central American studies scholars in this moment, in this conjuncture, right? What is our analysis providing, right? It's not, we shouldn't just be thinking about what policy approach I'm going to take or what policy implications I could do for my research. More providing a radical analysis of the problem. I think that needs to be done, right? And I think again, I use the word organic intellectual for Roberto because I really mean it. The idea that we come from the working class into these spaces, and how are we going to continue to struggle for the working class, for the oppressed people in these spaces, right? In whatever trinchera we're in. And I think for Central American scholars, that's vital, that's important. But we have to be careful because we are in the U.S. Academy, which really tends to make us into professionalized neoliberals, right? We're shaped into thinking about our academic accolades and upward mobility and all the grants and funding we could get, rather than thinking about the conditions of our people, right? And that's not because we just choose to it. We're conditioned, right? The academy conditions us. So how do we challenge those contradictions that we have, right? Because a lot of our students that are Central American are being influenced by the universities, right? That obviously that attend the university, because the majority of our people don't. But those that do and take up leadership roles are influenced by these things. So how do we challenge that in these spaces? And I think again, the book that you offer us, Roberto, is important for that, right? To provide your organic development as who you are today, right? And that gives us that context, right? For us to think and reflect our own conditionings, our own histories in our own community, in our own barrios, right? To see how did that shape us and how do we carry that forward in organizing our communities intellectually and politically, right?
And I want to follow up on what Stephen just said. I think there's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of, organic intellectuals from the South that we need to be in conversation with, right? I'm just thinking of, during, the Civil War, the periods of continued violence in El Salvador, and the methods that, our colleagues in the South, in Central America and so forth have always enacted, the trabajo de comunidades de base, right? That, are so germane to the work that was done in the 80s, but continues to be work that we could do with our communities here. So I'm always troubled that, we may go towards the North and, talk about the work that we do, here, but we need to be grounded, as one of my cousins who passed away a while ago said, you always need to be grounded in your roots. We have roots, right, that we can't afford to cut off. So, and I think Roberto has this ability to be connected, right? And this book, shows us, this transnational framework, right? But the work that continues to draw from, those organizers in El Salvador. I don't know if Roberto might want to say something.
You're muted, Roberto.
Sorry. I don't have much to add to that. It's funny. A lot of people only know me as an organizer. Now I get to be out as an author, and you all are doing like The Godfather 3 and dragging me down. Every time I try to get out, they drag me back into being.
They're not mutually exclusive.
I'm trying to reinvent myself and put that political stuff behind me. I'm kidding. Sure. I think I put it out there. I let me tell you how difficult it was to hold things in my past for 30 years that I never talked about. We all have those secrets in our families, but the nations that we belong to or that we inhabit also hold secrets. And I try to draw the parallel between the secrets of the padre and the secrets of the patria, right? Because they're both political in different ways. And, I was never out except outside a small circle. Like I used to run doing organizing stuff with some revolutionary circles here in San Francisco in the beginning with Anna's cousins. And there's a whole history there that's mentioned in the book. I didn't get into as much detail as I would have liked, but I held in secret this stuff for a long time for security reasons. I mean, there's so many revolutionaries, Salvadoreño, Nicaraguense, and other revolutionaries walking around the cities of the United States. When you consider that one of every 3 Salvadoreños was organized against the state at the height of the war, according to the UCA, you have this highly political community that's kind of been neutralized and demobilized by many factors, not least of which is kind of the new moment that we're in where, the digital moment has kind of has not helped the left, I think, in many ways. As you see with Bukele's ability to maneuver and lie and manipulate as if he represents something new other than neo-fascist practice. So I came out as a former revolutionary, precisely because I wanted to share kind of that knowledge and that experience, but most importantly, the heart, right? Does your heart beat like this? Do you get pissed off like I do when you see things like I've seen? Do you want to do something about it? Well, here's an option. Is kind of one of the points of my book. And I guess one other thing I want to emphasize, because, you know, we've talked about apocalypse and some heavy shit. There's also a lot of levity in the book. I mean, the only way I knew of getting through the gravity, the mass graves, was the levity, whether it's in my father's and mother's, you know, musical home, the love, the funny, the jokes, my abuelita, mamate, or my running with my homies here in the city, you know, in a little clique. You know, we weren't just some hardened criminals stealing and robbing, which we did do, and engaging in violence. We were also kids. So I think I just want to make sure that we underscore kind of the Salvadoran version of Emma Goldman's need for the revolutionary to dance. The revolutionary has to be leve as well. Kind of like, yeah, like Cavalcanti, the poet Cavalcanti in Italo Calvino's Memos, lightness essay in his Memos for a New Millennium.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think the idea of revolution and revolutionary, the dance and the importance of even the word revolution, I think is important that you have it in your title, right? That you still continue to carry that, exactly, right? That is still there, because I think for some people that idea is outdated or is something that we can't even fathom anymore. Yet the conditions in our current moment call for a revolutionary aspiration to something different, right? And you know, and I think, and I wanted to ask you about that, right? Because in your book you show your development towards this revolutionary potential and perspective from being a youth in San Francisco. And to me, what was, when I was reading your book, the most shocking part, the evangelical Roberto Lovato. Can you tell us about that transformation? You know, like what, because you could get it in the book, but I want to hear you. Like, what was it that transformed you, aside from Berkeley classes on fascism?
Gloria a Dios, hermano, gracias, because I'm going to come out again. I'm back to my evangelical ways. You sinful scholars, godless, unbelievers, want to bring you back to the fold with Jesus, con Jesús el Señor. No, actually, I put that in there because it's true. To get out of the kind of pretty dangerous and difficult life that I was in here, and I'm here on Mission Street in San Francisco, and this is where we used to run, and people were started getting killed in the 80s. And we started seeing the proliferation of guns when there wasn't that much in the 70s here. And I kind of had to get out because friends were getting killed and committing suicide and things. And so I found Jesus because my friend Hiram Vasquez planted the seeds of that. And I will say that I still look at some of that as positive, not in terms of the right-wing fascism that had me on my knees praying por la elección de Ronald Reagan, señor. No, that's not, but the part that taught me to be militant. I learned to be militant in the church. Before I got into the Frente, I was already militant because of the evangelical training that I got. I had discipline that I never had as a young person. And, you know, I also learned the power of the Bible. And then when I encountered liberation theology in Chalatenango in the comunidades de base, the part of me that had died to Jesus after I left the church, because I said, man, I can't have sex. And, you know, this is pretty fucking right wing. I'm going to get out of this. I found liberation theology, and it just blew my mind in the middle of this, you know, communities that are being bombarded, strafed, disappeared, death squad. You know, the word of God as a word of liberation. I was, as the former theology student, was blown away. And so that took me on the journey that led to becoming a revolutionary. And then realizing that, you know, I used to pledge allegiance to the flag and cry when, you know, Willie Mays and the San Francisco Giants would be playing. They'd play the national anthem. And, you know, I pledged allegiance in school, and I defended America against those commie Salvadorans that I met when I was a child. And then I came from that to saying, well, fuck America in me. I'm never going to call myself American again. after seeing what the United States did to those children in Chalatenango. You know, because the destruction of Central American childhood is not new to either Barack Obama, Donald Trump, or Joe Biden, you know. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of my journey that's in the book.
Thank you for that. I love this discussion. So I'm going to ask this question. I hope it's not too controversial. So there is this understanding in Central America, even now, right, of organizations and movement leaders that in order to change what's going on, say in Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador, that we need to mobilize the same solidarity networks, right? These networks that basically are North Americans, white Americans that can talk to Congress. Can you talk to us about that? Like whether when you were building the solidarity movement in the late 80s, early 90s, was there an understanding that we needed white persons to be at the forefront of the solidarity, or you know, and then how has that radically changed just based on where we are now, right? Like, talk to us about solidarity, because I think that most people don't realize how influential you were in building the solidarity movement as well.
Solidarity I'm actually across the street from where the home of an organization here in San Francisco, the San Francisco office of the Committee in Solidarity to the People of El Salvador on 26th, corner with Mission, CISPES. I'm sure Ana Patricia remembers. But I don't think the compañeros fascinated me. Me being kind of this Salvadoran Chicano. I had a lowrider, like you can look at my Twitter feed today. I'm kind of put pictures of an old 62 Merc that I used to have and cruising in my lowrider days. So, you know, I saw the compañeros come en masse with migration, and I'm like fascinated because they had an analysis of politics and of fascism and of, you know, of conception of organizing that was just astonishing to me, especially the storyteller. I mean, to watch the way that they would translate their experience into the United States to create arguably one of the most powerful social movements alongside the anti-nuke movement of the 80s and the environmental movement of the 80s. So solidarity and you know, it was never, but one of the things that they didn't bring was a clear analysis of race in the US. Brilló por su ausencia el análisis de la cuestión racial. And you see that in many different ways, in the way that when it came time to translate things into English, for example, here at Carecen on 22nd in South Van Ness, you know, I was a writer then, but I wasn't publicly writing, but I had a decent command of the English language. But instead of having me help translate, they would go, okay, la compañera Wendy va a traducir ahorita. And I'm like, fuck, you know, and the way that they would see us here in the US was kind of secondhand gringos. So that was not my favorite part. I put a scene in there about that to show that, because we hadn't yet built Central American study. We hadn't had authors like Ana Patricia, whose book I just got and am absorbing because it's for my next project, building an institutional understanding of ourselves as actors here. And but the fact is that the compañeras and compañeros were always there behind the scenes, exercising power from behind the scenes because of things like undocumented status, the trauma of war, and the national surveillance state, right? Because we were in fact being infiltrated by the FBI, looked at by the CIA. I mean, we have the receipts. You can go to the congressional record and look up CISPES El Salvador, and you can find documents to show that local police departments and the FBI had mobilized in all 50 states of the United States where the FBI operated to infiltrate us. Fortunately, they brought the methods from El Salvador that minimized that. It's just an incredible story, the story of solidarity that we need to really tell.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat, and but panelists, feel free to jump in at any point as well. So one question from Guadalupe Escobar. Roberto, I found your concept of unforgetting really evocative. It made me also think about the importance of what Yahaira Padilla calls unsilencing within the trans-Salvadoran context. Could you talk a little about how you arrived at formulation of Unforgetting?
Yeah, I was trying to, I view my book and I wrote it as a series, as an underworld journey into a bunch of intersecting underworlds. The underworld of my family, the underworld of my father's secret past, the underworld of my own, the underworld of my dad's involvement in criminal networks, where he was running guns and other contrabando to El Salvador. The underworld of my own involvement in, kind of youth clique and criminal activity. The underworld of the guerrillas, the underworld of the gangs, the underworld of the secrets of nations like El Salvador, and especially the United States. So given those intersecting underworlds that I'm trying to connect in is, I started studying the way that the tropes of, and I would love to hear Ana Patricia's thoughts on this, the way the underworld trope works in literature. And in civilizations through time, Mayan, European, East Asian, different African, the underworld serves as a place where you go in times of crisis often. Because what's on the en la superficie is intolerable. You can't really get what you need in the surface world, so you have to go under. Like we had to go clandestine in secret safe houses and in guerrilla hideouts in El Salvador. And we had to keep our militancy secret here in the US. So, I'm also looking at, fuck, man, I forgot the best part of myself. I hadn't been out about having been somebody who risked my life, a US born kid here on Folsom Street, down the street from the projects, who committed to a revolutionary struggle. I couldn't say shit about that because I was scared. Like every compañera that I know in the US didn't want to say anything because it's really dangerous because of, the reactionary nature of US surveillance state and police state. But I said, Donald Trump helped convince me, fuck it, I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna come out. So I got to unforget one of the best parts of myself. And in the process, I came to this concept that I learned first in theology, and then later on at Berkeley in philosophy class with a German philosophy teacher who taught me about Hannah Arendt's approach to unforgetting, aletheia, the Greek concept. The Greeks had this idea of the journey into the underworld of the dead required them before going to Hades or Elysium, kind of the pre-heaven and hell, right, for the Greeks. They had to go across the river Lethe, the Lethe River, which was the river of forgetting. So the dead had to forget who they were in life. And that journey was across the river of forgetting, of Lethe River. And the journey to unforget was aletheia, unforgetting, not Lethe River. And I saw that, I was like, man, I was enthralled by it. And then to hear Hannah Arendt talk about it, to read Hannah Arendt talking about it, the German philosopher of fascism and other things, to hear her talking about the necessity to unforget as a way to fight fascism in the theater of history was compelling to me. And then to think about that and connect it to memoria histórica tradition in America Latina and US and in Latin American literatures just compelled me, and I just felt cool to do.
Thank you so much for that. And panelists, if you want to jump in, please do so. The next question is from Ulla Berg, our organizer. My question is about transnational conversations, intellectually and politically. Do you have any plans of translating the book into Spanish? What are your thoughts about difundir el libro in Central America? And how can the perspectives from US Salvadorans be useful to people and communities in the region?
Oh, difficult. Good but difficult question. There's a Salvadoran phrase that I like to respond to that. A huevo. A chinchita lapate. However I can do it, I want to translate. I have to, right now we're working on the paperback. We're finalizing it. Several of you come out in my acknowledgments because as my friend and fellow writer Cristina Rivera Garcia talks about, the communality of writing. It's never like this individual act. It's always a collective act, and we need to rescue that. And so, yeah, I have plans. I just have to deal with the paperback, and then have a conversation with my publisher, Harper Collins, to see if they want to do it. If not, I'm then going to go back, probably go to either Spain or America Latina to get a really top-notch Spanish language publisher to do it. And then if I have to, get on a fucking burro and go distribute it throughout the Americas. And as far as what we have to teach them, I don't know. I do know we have to teach them about us. We have a right to teach them about us. We have a necessity to teach them about us so that we don't reproduce. I mean, I didn't even know this word transnational because some of you scholars came to Carecen when I was there in the 90s. They were telling me, oh, it's amazing that Carecen and the Central American refugees are doing transnational work. I said, what is that? Because, Carecen had an office in El Salvador, and we were doing like this really innovative human rights and legal work across borders. And we didn't even think, hey, let's do some transnational work. We were just doing what we needed to do for solidarity. So I don't know what we have to teach them over there, except perhaps what we are and who we are in this country, because, oftentimes they over there look at us kind of like the way that Chicanos in the US are looked at in many ways. It's kind of like second-class citizens or this fucking cash cow for remesas or something. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
It's so interesting. Oh, go ahead, Ana Patricia.
I want to follow up on that because to get your thoughts on yes, how they see us. In other words, Salvadoreños in the country, right? So I was in a panel yesterday, not in a panel, but I was I attended a session yesterday where it was about Central American immigrant literature, right? And so they seem to think that, that it was new, that, it hasn't been done before, right? That, we're always migrantes attached like a satellite of El Salvador, right? And so, that is about like, focalization, where you're seeing the diaspora from and the difference between having a perspective that is diasporic, right? Where you're always in between and away, and that's where you're situated. Okay. So my question to you, Roberto, following what you just said, right? Maybe we don't have anything to teach anybody in terms of, these are our experiences, but yet they're experiences that are very connected to other places as well, right? So what I wanted to ask you is how, and as a writer, how you see yourself when people position you as, in the United States as an ethnic writer, in El Salvador as a Salvadoran writer, right? In the United States, in some contexts as an immigrant writer, right? So there's all these classifications for, what one can be doing. So how do you navigate those spaces, and how do you speak to different publics, different readers of your work?
That's an excellent question that I need one of those PhDs you all carry in your back pockets to respond to. But I see. Let me give the example of what I did to get this book published, because this is the first nonfiction book published by a Big Five publisher, Harper Collins, in the English language, and published by it's the first Central American nonfiction book that they've decided. It's not like we haven't been here for decades, right? You know this better than anyone, Ana Patricia. But the fact is that we're not, and you also know that there's a lot of Central American writers all across the US. Here in San Francisco, Leticia Hernandez, Maya Chinchilla, Mario Bencastro over there in DC. We're everywhere, but we're nowhere in the publishing industry on a larger scale, proportional to our numbers. So there are political, cultural reasons for that. And I had to pull out my political strategist hat to figure out how to navigate. I spent 6 months strategizing how to create a proposal that would, first of all, get into the publishing system and then get into it on my terms. So the way I got in was to titillate them with stories of gangs, migration, and family, right? And they like that because, like in the title, they made me get this subtitle because I just wanted it to be Unforgetting. But they insisted, and my consiglieres in publishing said, hey, they're right. Right now we're in COVID. You need a subtitle because nobody's going to know, the book unless you kind of have what they call search engine optimization ready things. So I had to configure the book subtitle for the digital era. But I also had this other thing. I wrote the book on my terms. So before I went into the power laden relationship that any writer is going to have with any major publisher or any publisher, I had already, what in strategy terms, defined the field of battle. So I wrote most of the book before I wrote the proposal, before I submitted it to the industry, so that they had to come into my territory and try to erase my shit on my grounds, versus just giving them a few chapters and then having them colonially say, you need to talk about this, you need to talk about this, right? And you need to take this out. So define the theater of battle. And then, I didn't really have to fight because I have a great agent, Julia Cardin, had a great editor, Aaron Wick, who respected me and respected my story and my language, and they enhanced the process. And I was also very aggressive in saying, and this speaks to your question again, like to them and to any agent or any editor that I spoke to, I said, thou shalt not tropicalize my ass. Okay, thou shalt not tropicalize me. Because oftentimes the way that authors, Latino authors, Latinx authors in the US go into the system is to do a minstrel, salsa, cumbia, bachata, ronda, whatever your dance of choice, is to Carmen Miranda our ass into the industry and reproduce what often is these colonial images of the white gaze, reproduced in publishing subconsciously by we ourselves. So fuck that. And so then when it came time to negotiate, I said, oh yeah, and we're going to put this word in the title too. And that's the one word that's not very search engine optimization ready. But for me, it was one of the most important, as important as any of those words was, revolution. I don't want to romanticize the notion, but I don't give a damn about Kamala Harris or the most diverse cabinet in the world. Still the same sinister empire. And we have to really, as thinkers, as organic intellectuals, as activists, really help create the imaginary that is going to challenge capitalism and empire at a moment of extreme crisis. So that was what was behind my thinking. So that was how I positioned myself in the book. You'd like to think you can just write like white people do. White people can go, I'm gonna write about Central Americans this time, but I'm gonna go next year, I'm gonna go to Haiti. I'm gonna write about Black people. I'm gonna go, but we don't get that luxury in the journalism and in other fields that other people get to write about others. So it's but I'm okay. One thing I don't do is you will not see the word American. I don't call myself American unless there's an accent on the E. I even had a TV show for a minute called Americans, for this word that I coined for myself.
And I think to that question about what we could teach, or and I think it's dialectical, right? We're going to learn from our people, and we're also going to teach our people, right? And I think one thing that we could talk about is the conditions of our communities here, right? I think that's the most vital part of this conversation, where sometimes, because of empire, we have the idea of what this country looks like to other people outside, and it isn't until they hear an actual testimonio of this place that they understand it, right? I often take my students to Cuba for study abroad, and one thing that stands out to a lot of Cubanos is Skid Row, for example. The fact that we have a Skid Row in Los Angeles, they can't fathom that. They think that this country, because of the blockade, because of the imperial mindset globally, they think of this place of opportunity for everybody, despite the conditions. You're poor, but you still have certain access to things, and it's true we have access to commodities, But when you explain to them that there is a Skid Row in Los Angeles, and at the housing crisis, and my students talk about student loans, right? The debt that the students have, los cubanos se quedan sorprendidos, no entienden. ¿Cómo puede ser que hay gente viviendo en la calle en cajas así? ¿O cómo puede ser que tienes tantos préstamos? I think those are the things that are oftentimes not said, right? That we can't forget to describe to people. So I think there is that conversation that is important, that dialectical conversation of understanding what's happening inside the belly of the beast. That I think your book, Roberto, does for a lot of people, right? Through a memoir form, right? And, we do it academically through like big, academic journals that oftentimes people don't get to read. But the fact that a memoir, is more easily digestible for a lot of people. And I think the way you've written it is an example of that. The fact that, that you provide your upbringing in San Francisco and try to make it the connections to your father's upbringing, right, in El Salvador. And, I just want to go back to the experience of as I was reading this, and I just thought of when I was reading Santiago, the Marero that you talked to. To me, that's also one of the most powerful moments because, I hate the word humanizing because we're all human. The people that are dehumanized are the ones that accept oppression and exploitation. They're the ones that are dehumanized. But to have a conversation and really give this person agency, to really have a conversation with a Marero that Trump, Kamala Harris, and all these other people want to criminalize and treat as a beast, when the system itself is the beast, you do really well. And I think that's something that's needed in this moment, right? And I think this is needed everywhere, right? So I think that's something that you could definitely do. And then something that a lot of us could do that grew up in these neighborhoods that had this violence in our communities, that understand it as systemic and structural and not as individual or symptomatic to a culture of people, right? Oftentimes the argument, it's just a culture of violence. Well, it's a systemic violence, not a culture of a violence, right? So I think those are things that stand out to me when thinking about what can be shared across borders, but also just building off of these experiences locally in our communities.
And if I could add to Stephen, the systemic, right? Because it's systemic forgetting that has been imposed on diasporic communities. And your book is, a pedagogical tool where, we can, learn through your book about, these very significant moments that, massacred, that destroyed our communities, that forced us into exile and into diaspora, right? If we think of, equivalent moments in other pueblos' history, the Jewish Holocaust, right? I'm not equating the two, but these apocalyptic moments that just, destroyed the fabric of our societies, right? And here we are in diaspora. And I think, back to the question, maybe what we can enter in conversation with, El Salvador and readers of your book in El Salvador is that you are holistically telling that larger story, right? That we are part of that history, but we're in a different place and literally in a different location with different experiences where, we're faced with, all the systemic oppressions and everything in other places, right? That oftentimes it's hard to understand unless you live them, right? So your book, kind of enters that space. And I think that's very important.
Thank you for saying that, Ana Patricia. I guess one other thing, I think there is something we can teach them over there. Again, coming back, it's that what it is like to be within the belly of the beast that we've been referring to here. Que nosotros también las tenemos bien puestas. That we are disposed to throw down and fight empire from inside, in immigrant rights, in labor rights, in the academies, against the fascism of the police in the United States, against all laws, against patriarchy in the United States, transphobia. We're in it, and we're in it hard, and we know how to throw down hard. And we deserve the respect of our ability, if for no other reasons, our ability to throw down here and what that's like. Because it's hard for people down south to imagine people struggling here. I mean, en otra manera, estamos en pañales aquí compared to the revolutionary struggle in America Latina, pero like I said, las tenemos bien puestas también.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to add to that, in my experience in Honduras, I remember when I first went back to do research in 2004, everybody kept referring to immigrants as el pequeño imperialista, right? That we were somehow had left because, and again, Honduras has a very different context, right, than El Salvador. But one of the things that I make my goal when I'm in Honduras is to talk about the 30-year-old immigrant rights, Central American immigrant rights movement, because it's 30 years, right? Since the 70s, 80s. I mean, I remember as a child going to El Rescate and getting in line to go talk to attorneys or going to Carecen, right? Like, so it's definitely my goal to always communicate that. And I think that folks really want to know, what it was like for us here as well. I have a couple of questions I don't want to miss that I want to throw out to the panelists from Eileen. What are the challenges of alignment as Central American or Central American in light of distinct histories and experiences based on home countries, migration differences, and varied US immigration and foreign policies? It's on the chat too, if you want to take a look.
Panelists?
Challenges of alignment as Central American.
Nobody's going to say anything. I think national identity can be a hindrance or an aid, depending on how you flip it. I like to use it to bring ourselves together, but I don't really like, as you read in my book's a commentary on the amnesia and violence that constitute nation states. By the same token, there's a pride, there's a flag, people cry for the flags. That's where people are emotionally and spiritually. So you kind of relate, and there's things in common in those stories constructed in the, what was it? Imagined community of the nation, right? So I think, let's not romanticize either. I mean, some of the worst, most heinous fascists I've ever met are Salvadoreño. Murder, killer, monsters. I mean, some of them are also gringos who are a little colder, better suited and whatnot. So I think having the way to do it is always just basically go back to the common interest, go back to values of solidarity, go back to a common enemy, quite frankly, and I hate to use the word enemy, but we do have enemies of the poor in the world. So that's some of the things.
I want to add to that. I think, there goes back to the idea of the organic intellectual, just Lovato providing us ways of thinking of how to do this, right? But I think, the idea of trying to find, like he said, a common theme or a common understanding of each other. And I think that, when we think of our situations of the nationalism and the nation and ethnic differences, a lot of those things become common sense, right? They're just common sense, and there's just things as is. And our role is to problematize them and to expand on them and build on them, but create a good sense. And Gramsci talked about a good sense, meaning that you use these ideas to build solidarity, to build organizing, right? That you meet people where they're at, as you just said, Roberto, right? I really like Robin Kelley, and it kind of reminded me of what you were talking about, Roberto. Robin Kelley, in his book on the communists in Alabama, said that the communists didn't use the Communist Manifesto; they used the Bible, because they recognized that you have to meet people where they're at, and they might not have read Marx, but they read Jesus, and they understood Jesus' plight of the poor, right? And I think that was something that's important to think about, right? I think we can't assume solidarity or assume a characteristic of we're all the same, we're all in the same boat. We have to build that, right? We have to organize that. We have to struggle through that, and it's not something that's just given. And especially in an imperialist capitalist system that divides and conquers based on difference and exploits difference. So I think that's something that, thinking about different distinct communities in Central America is really trying to build that and not assume that it's already there just because you come from the same nation state, right? I think we have to organize it and build it. But, the danger of that, though, is also falling in that idea that you can't build solidarity because we're so different, right? That we just don't, you don't understand my condition, so you're just against me. And I think that's a common thread that's happening in the moment, right? That we, instead of trying to work through solidarity and be on the ground with people and deal with people's contradictions and messiness, right? And that's something you highlight in the book, right? Dealing with the messiness of people, your driver, right? The fact that you had to be with your driver the whole time, the driver being a member of the military before, and having to sit there with him and talk to him. And obviously, I don't know where that friendship went later, but in that book, you didn't immediately cut it off. You had to try to build and trust and relationship building. And I think that's something that needs to be done and taken seriously in this moment, right? Across national and ethnic differences, right? I think about, me growing up Salvadoran and Mexican in Los Angeles, right? Having to build that coalition, understanding that, there is nothing innate against each other, right? That this is out of structural conditions that has pinned immigrant communities against each other, state violence against each other, right? When I think about Central Americans crossing through Mexico, right? That experience of Mexican chauvinism that people experience, right? How do we challenge that rather than just say that that's what it is and that's how it's always been? No, we build solidarity, we organize it, and that's difficult to do, but doesn't mean we can't do it, right? Especially those of us that have these intellectual tools and know better than that, right? So I think that it's difficult to align, but it must be done given what you just described, Lovato, as this country that we're living in and the conditions that you mentioned.
One of the great aligners of our age, probably the greatest, is and is going to be climate change. The challenge of every generation now is going to be have a direct connection. I could have put a lot of climate change stuff in the book. When you look at the flooding, the dry corridor in Central America, when you look at the way that climate change has altered. I mean, there's a relation between that and violence in El Salvador, as scholars have studied. There's a great book that I read many years ago, but it seems relevant again today. It's Climate Change and Catastrophe in Cuba and the Atlantic World in the Age of Revolution, where it points out that climate change which actually helped the revolutionary processes in the Atlantic world by weakening the empire. So that's a kind of a nice thing to be thinking about at this moment.
I love it. I want to just also add that, Salvadorans in Los Angeles, where I grew up, and the place where I, kind of my motherland, one of my motherlands, right? Because I also have Honduras as my motherland. The Salvadorans were the first to turn out against the coup in Honduras, and this is how I become linked very closely with the comités de base in Los Angeles. And, there were protests planned even before the coup happened. That's how forward-thinking Salvadorans were, right? They knew it was going to happen, right? And these comités, Maria Guardado, Vernimoto, I mean, all these folks were out there at MacArthur Park already. And when the media came up to, Maria Guardado, she would say, ahora soy hondureña. Today I'm Honduran, right? Today I speak as a Honduran, because they understood the importance of getting the news out into like Telemundo, Univision, and that kind of stuff. We have one more question, and I want to make sure we answer it before we run out of time. En español, hola, una pregunta. ¿Cuáles son los tropos revolucionarios de hoy? ¿Son nuevas o renovadas ideas? ¿Cómo el paso del tiempo, la transnacionalización y transgeneracionalización ha incorporado previas ideas y luchas y renovado? Está en el chat de profesora Roberta Villalón.
Puta, como decimos en buen salvadoreño, está jocote esa pregunta. Look, how would I respond to that? I mean, what are the tropes of revolutionary that are relevant? Revolutionary tropes that are relevant at this moment? Is that my understanding of the question?
Yeah, so what are the revolutionary tropes of today? Are they new or renovated, or new ideas, or renovated or dug up from the past? How has the time?
Personally, I think it has to be a mix of the past and the present. I'm getting older, and I do believe that those of us of a certain political experience and in the past have learned some very valuable lessons about how to conceive politics, how to engage them, how to narrate the stories of our moments in literature and in other ways, and how to do so in a way that protects your the purity of whatever your intention and your cause is. There's something about that I think, the uprootedness of this moment where there's just so much distraction, so much migration within countries and beyond countries that, holding down the hard line would be a trope. You've got to have something that I'm going to try to communicate in my next book, which is called Letters to a Young Poet Warrior. And it's going to be me conversing with the boy that I helped raise. His name's Gio. And I'm going to be writing things about this to this young man who forced me to watch The Last Airbender and all the wisdom and martial arts thing in there about 50 times. So now I get to share my own version of The Last Airbender, which was being part of a revolutionary movement. The way that people thought, la mística. There's a certain way you behave. There's a certain way the revolutionary would speak and was trained to speak. ¿Cómo se comporta uno como dirigente? There's things in there that are very valuable to politics even now in this moment. There's things that aren't, because a lot of our compañeras and compañeros became dinosaurs who didn't evolve with the moment, right? I think anybody who's younger and got involved with solidarity at a certain stage experienced the patriarchy, the sexism, the old school, the racist stuff, that some folks had. So I would say there has to be a mix between the classic rock era, Led Zeppelin, Santana era of revolutionary thought, and the digital moment today.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, Steven.
Yo más quería decir que no hemos superado la explotación del humano al humano. We haven't surpassed that yet. We're not past the exploitation of one person by another. So I think, in this moment, we still have to look at the past and the historical lessons of revolution that have occurred, the failures, the successes, and adapt them to the current conditions of the moment. So I do think that, given that in this current moment we're starting to see a rise of youth interested in socialism, what does that mean to this moment? I know that again, that's one of the words that people are afraid of, just like revolution. But what does that mean to have people at this moment having an interest in it? Maybe not being clear what exactly it is, but the fact that there's an interest in it. And the fact that the ideological dog catchers of the capitalist state are always trying to prevent it, are always trying to stop people from having a revolutionary vision, right, of challenging an alternative. I see this all the time when I travel to Cuba with my youth, with my students, right? That Cuba, with all its mistakes and contradictions, is providing an alternative that when students come back, they can't believe it, right? They can't believe not the economic or the political relationships, but the solidarity that's built amongst people because of a revolution on the ground. The treatment of each other. Que se dicen compañera, compañera, hermano, hermano, no? That they don't talk about usted, right? They laugh at us because we use usted when we're down there. Like, we're not a slave relation. You don't got to talk to us that way. Yeah? These things, these cultural shifts are still present and important today. And as Roberto was saying about the mística, the dirigente, right? All that stuff I learned too when I was as a youth member of the party, right? That you have to carry those things forward. And so I think there's a lot that we could learn from the moment, right? A lot that we could learn them locally from the Black radical tradition, right? That has really informed me, right? From the abolition movement, but also remembering the radical socialist and communist movements that we can never forget that were repressed in this country, right? From Black communists, right? Asian communists, that they were organizing for an alternative. And I think those people are still people that we could learn from and build on, right? Because to this day, across the globe, there are still revolutions in construction. And we could learn from those, right?
Go ahead.
Maybe the trope of liberation, right? Because, increasingly, right, we're seeing, systemic oppressions, right, that contain the agency of people. I go back to liberation theology, right? La opción por los pobres. That was a deliberate choice by people who aligned with, making life better for the poor, right? But we can opt for, humanity. We can opt for the climate. We can opt for so many things that are going awry right now, right? And put ourselves in a position of action in the mode of liberation. So I see liberation as a constant trope throughout history. If we think of, even, Guerra de Independencia, right? They wanted to liberate from whatever, right? Las revoluciones, liberation. And now, it's taken a different valence, but it's all about liberation.
Thank you all, and I'm sorry, I'm so horrible as a timekeeper, but thank you to our organizer, Ula Berg. We have less than 10 minutes for closing remarks. So why don't we go to Roberto, and then we go to our panelists.
I want to hear our panelists.
Anna, you want to go first? Or?
Sure, since, I started. So again, it's been an honor to be in this panel with our, fellow participants here. And the book Unforgetting, for me, the key is this act of unforgetting, as I tried to articulate at the very beginning, right? There are theories of forgetting in memory studies, right? Which, I've been looking at. But unforgetting, as Roberto says, and I'll send you the citation, Roberto, as you say in the book, right? It's this active will to recuperate history, to act upon it, right? To change it. So I think that what your book leaves with me is that, we're all agents of change, agents of unforgetting, right? And in the context of the Central American revolutions or, civil strifes, etc., right? We have a lot of history that we need to recuperate, and that is particularly important in the context of the diaspora, right? There's a lot of things that we need to unforget. There's a lot of things we need to remember, right? And I think that for me, your book is this volume where everything is packaged, where, we can use it as a resource for people who are in different stages of, learning or recuperating or whatnot. So I think it's a gift to the field right now of Central American studies, right? And I hope that it becomes standard reading.
Thank you. Again, thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's really an honor to be here with you, Roberto, and everyone else. Again, I want to thank Roberto also for letting me do the teaching guide. So if you notice in his post there, the teaching guide is an important tool if you want to teach the book. And luckily I was fortunate to be able to work on that for you. And throughout the book, there's moments where, as I was reading it, I was at the same places that Roberto was. There in 1990, in the early 90s, when there was a peace treaty happening with the gangs in Los Angeles, Roberto talks about being in Legion Park and going for a jog there. I was with my brother walking through the park around that same time as well. And so it's interesting to think about, like, wow, me and Roberto might have crossed paths, but I was here a little mocoso, or just walking around there, right? The Rampart scandal, right? I was there when I went to Belmont High School at the time that Roberto was talking about the Rampart scandal, right? So all these different moments, and I think this book, I go back to the main points that I brought up, right? The idea of the organic intellectual and their development, right? So this is a way of thinking of, if you read this book, think of the development of an organic intellectual in the making as you're reading this book. Think about the importance of analyzing the capitalist state and capitalism, not forgetting that that's the conditions that we're up against. And in order to understand that, to have an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist analysis that's intersectional, that includes an analysis of race, gender, class, right? All those things. So when I say anti-imperialist, that's what I mean, right? To have a understanding of the many determinations and relations of the system. And I think, Roberto's book really does that for us. And I thank you for the writing this and including me in this conversation. And, maintaining that mística revolucionaria that we that we must never forget, right? Especially for those of us that are in the belly of the beast, that make it so easy to forget, right? Because of the seductions of the system that we live in. So thank you. I hope to continue in conversation with all of you, one day hopefully in person, right? And revolutionary greetings to everyone out there. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I just first want to thank again Jaconda and Ula and Suyapa for bringing us all together for this outstanding conversation, for me at least. You know, I've been doing a few of these, and this one was unique porque tuvo el toque nuestro. You all in the commentators, you know, Stephen and Anna and Tuyapa, like, you know, in your beautiful radical selves in each of your different disciplines and your personal walk, I found myself being a student and wanting to clap and applaud. You know, and really, I would just leave people with, you know, I think we did our community proud today. I really am. I really believe like you all showed how badass intellectually our community is, and how badass politically is not separate from being badass literarily, sociologically, politically, whatever your discipline, it's together. So I appreciate you and salute you all as scholar warriors that you are, and I incite you to prepare your students for the very, very difficult reality of wherever we're going to be. We're going to have to drop knowledge like what we've tried to drop here today. So it's been my honor and privilege to share what my little corner of that experience is, and I look forward to similar conversations in other settings, like, you know, wherever that is. Y gracias.
Gracias a todos. No se les olvide la copia del libro. Don't forget, you can get a free copy. It's on the chat. It's on the Facebook chat underneath the video on LASA's official Facebook page. You can get a free copy of the book, an e-copy, and you can also get a free study guide that Dr. Stephen Osuna has developed. Muchas gracias a todos. Espero que tengan un buen resto de su día.